congratulations, man, for
Oh,
doing
thank you.
your movie, The Social Dilemma, which I believe it premiered on Netflix on September 9th. You want to tell us a
Yep.
little bit about that?
Yeah, we first premiered at Sundance earlier this year, and then it went live on Netflix just about 2 weeks ago. The response has been amazing and through the roof. It's been really, really incredible just to make something that is resonating so strongly with the public. We've been completely blown away and humbled. It's been in the top 10 for the last 2 weeks. So it's been pretty wild. And it's hit #1 in a number of countries as well. So #1 in India, Colombia, and some others. And just getting these little feeders, and people are sending me screenshots of, wow, it's #1 over here.
Wow.
So it's been very exciting.
Well, congratulations on your great success coming out of the box. Now, I know that I met you when you were working on a film called Chasing Ice with James Baylog.
Yeah.
And the Extreme Ice Survey, and that made a big splash, no pun intended. And that was a film focusing mostly on climate, and then that was followed up by Chasing Coral, again, climate. So how do you go from two films that are primarily focused on the climate crisis and what's happening in our physical world to something that's focused on the social media?
Yeah, I think for me, it was always just looking at what are the big issues of our time? How can we reveal hidden stories around big issues? After we did Chasing Ice, the story of coral reefs changing was brought to us, and we realized we had a huge opportunity to tell a story that was a climate story from about something I really knew nothing about. And I think that's been a big rubric for me personally. If I am unaware of something that I'm learning through others that are experts in a field, and if it hits me in a strong way, my hope and my expectation is that it'll respond similarly to others, that other people might also find it new and revelatory. So a couple of years ago, I started learning from former tech insiders that there was a problem with how the tech was designed. And this completely blew me away. I mean, I had so many friends who worked in Facebook and Google and Twitter and all these companies, and I'd never heard anybody criticize the fundamental business model, the fundamental backbone of what made these companies so rich. And in that process of hearing these critiques from the people themselves who made it, that really, really blew my mind. And I found it to be such a compelling narrative and just wanted to share it with others.
Wow, that's amazing. So getting into that business model, I believe I think that you called it surveillance capitalism.
Yeah. So this is also, I've realized how nuanced and complicated this whole technology field is. There is a micro-targeting advertising business model that is part of our attention economy, which is part of this new framework called surveillance capitalism. Just to draw a parallel for a second, Shoshana Zuboff, one of our experts in the film, makes a comparison to industrial capitalism. That industrial capitalism figured out ways to turn nature into a raw resource for extraction and exploitation that yielded great profits. That is the cookie cutter example of the fossil fuel industry, just figuring out a way to pull something out of the ground and turn it into money. These companies now, these surveillance capitalists have, like if you go to Facebook or Google or Twitter, you're not paying. Right? We, the public, don't pay to use these services, but how are they making their hundreds of billions of dollars? They are collecting data about us. They're collecting our life experience. They're extracting from us all the things that we do. Facebook has something like 29,000 data points about you. Like 29,000, just try to think about writing 29,000 things about yourself and how difficult that would be. Facebook has 29,000 entries about what makes Chip tick, what's going to work on you, and what's going to get you to come back to the platform, what's going to get you to spend more time here, and how can I create this model of you and sell you something, whether that's an ad or an idea. And so, as Shoshana Zuboff says, these surveillance capitalists have turned human experience into a raw resource for extraction. We are the thing being mined. And so that's within the surveillance capitalism frame. And in the film, we really talked about the attention economy, a subset of that, and all of the consequences that we see because of it.
Wow. Well, it's it seems to be a runaway train.
Yeah.
And I was very taken aback by some of Shoshana Zuboff's remarks, actually, where she mentioned something called massive scale contagion. Quite a
Hmm.
quite a term to use. And what she was referring to is how that the social media networks have gotten subliminal views to the point where they can actually get people to do certain things. As an example, vote a
Right.
certain way in an election.
Right. The research that she's referencing there was just trying to push people to vote. In that particular research, it wasn't to vote a particular way, but they discovered that they were able to get people to vote in greater numbers, in a meaningful amount. And this is what the Facebook data scientists have been discovering, that they have so much power in how these algorithms operate that they really are reprogramming society in a big way, both intentionally and unintentionally, in terms of how the algorithms are written. Um, Yuval Harari describes this as this technology will know you better than you know yourself. Right? When I have 29,000 data points about you and I know what you're interested in, some have said it'll know that you're gay before you know that you're gay. Right? And that's a very loaded phrase, but part of this is that it can identify trends across thousands and millions of people. People are often wondering, oh, I talked about this thing and Facebook listened with their microphone and they showed me an ad for the thing. And the reality is they're not using, Facebook at least, is not using the microphone as part of its data collection, interestingly. What's actually going on is even scarier. What's actually going on is that they just have such a good model of you. They know you so well that they know what you're likely going to be talking about and thinking about. Not just because we know you, but we know 38,012 people that are just like you, that exhibit similar patterns and trends to you. And all of them are now talking about this new thing. So we think that you're going to be interested in this new thing as well. That's basically how they've been able to sell advertisers on the power of their services. There's a thing called lookalike models. So, hey, I want to advertise a certain thing to a certain group of people. I've got an email list. These are the people that I'm looking for. Find me more people who look like that I can sell my product to. And because they've collected so much information about us, they can, with pretty high precision and accuracy, find people who look just like that.
Wow, it's a brave new world, isn't it?
It is. It's happening like within reach and yet invisibly at the same time. We interact with these devices on a daily basis and we're giving them more and more insights into our souls. And those insights aren't being used for our benefit. It's being used for a financial profit motive. And it's that motive that has now spiraled and dominoed into these countless consequences that we're seeing, both from the individual mental health aspects and rising rates of self-harm and suicide, particularly amongst young girls, all the way to the societal issues of polarization, conspiracy theories running rampant, fake news, misinformation, and the breakdown of truth itself.
Can we move to a conversation around how has surveillance capitalism affected the environment? Can we connect COVID, climate, and social media?
COVID, climate, and social media. That is interesting. I'll put a pin on the COVID part, but in terms of climate and social media, this is in some ways the reason why we got into this film in the first place, because with our past projects, Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral, we were trying to go out and do impact with our films. And we were trying to go speak to the public and say, hey, look at what's going on. We need to take action. And we kept finding people who denied climate change. And that was just such a baffling slap in the face. It's like, we know the science is so good. Look at this overwhelming amount of science. We have moved past the point of debate. And yet we were finding countless times in this country in particular, more and more people who just vehemently believed that climate change was a hoax. And we have one scene of the film. It's also the opening scene in the trailer. If you do a Google search for climate change is, and you look at the auto suggestions, the autocomplete suggestions that it offers, the answers are so completely different based on what it thinks it knows about you and what it thinks you want. And it's been amazing to see, like, people have been engaging with this on their own after the film has come out. So people are sending in their own, this is what I get when I search for climate changes, and here's my screenshot. And people are putting in all these different answers, like whether it's a hoax or a joke or the biggest issue we've ever dealt with. We're getting a huge range of examples like that. And so in my mind, we won't be able to address issues like climate change if we have algorithms that are constantly pushing out misinformation based on what it thinks you're looking for.
So when it comes to social media being a platforms of communication, and it seems to me that that's happening across all mediums.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you're an impact filmmaker. I also do that, and for us to think that now COVID, which I think we have to connect COVID and climate, are actually keeping movie theaters shut down with the social distancing in terms. So now it's Netflix and Amazon Prime and all of the other companies, Google TV, et cetera. How do you see that playing out in the future? Not so much in terms of the business model. Obviously, that's happening, but in terms of the delivery of information.
The point that we're trying to bring to light in the film is a look at the advertising business model. And that applies to the social media companies that we're talking about. It applies to YouTube and Google and TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter. But it also does apply to the cable news networks and to a lot of journalism, where after Reagan disbanded the Fairness Doctrine, which was a law that we had on the books that said that news outlets needed to cover both sides of a story fairly. Once that was disbanded, it sort of gave rise to the opportunity to have polarized news outlets like an MSNBC or a Fox News that are driven by the same metric of advertising, which is why we count ratings, which is why we are just paying attention to, like, how popular is this thing. I think we're just measuring the wrong thing. Like, those are the wrong metrics to be measuring, right? Because it incentivizes this lowest common denominator, or it incentivizes extreme and outrageous and anger-inducing content. We now know, like, anger is the currency of the internet. Like, it is the emotion that works the fastest and the most efficiently, and that's not helping us in a pursuit of truth and fairness and honesty. When you look at the entertainment companies that you're listing, so when you look at a Netflix or an HBO or a Hulu or an Apple TV, like, we pay for those. We pay for a subscription to HBO or to Netflix. We also don't see misinformation and conspiracy theory running viral on those platforms, right? So they might not be perfect platforms, and they still have a lot of their other faults and flaws. But in terms of where you see misinformation and conspiracy theories running viral, where they are eroding a shared sense of truth, the fact that flat eartherism is going on a crazy rise is mind-boggling, and that's happening in large part through YouTube videos. It's happening through Facebook and through Twitter. So those are the platforms, and I don't think anybody has, like, a solve for this. It's a blend between the business model and user-generated content that are adding to this level of misinformation and conspiracy theory. When you look at the news outlets and cable television, that's not user-generated content. There are still gatekeepers there, but they have morphed. They basically are just social media in slow motion, right? The social media platforms have just become more efficient at the individualized targeting and advertising model incentive, that they're doing what they set out to do really, really well. It's just that they set out to do a problematic thing, right? The algorithms are working just like they were designed for. They were designed to grow quickly. They were designed to keep you engaged. They were designed to figure out how to maximize revenue. Those are things that are working extremely well on these platforms. The challenge is we need to go back to them and say, hey, look, you guys have to rebuild this stuff. Just like we have to go back to the fossil fuel industry and say, hey, you guys did a really good job of extracting this thing. We recognize there are consequences now, and we have to switch you from a fossil fuel industry to an energy industry. And how do we make a transition that is aligned with human civilization? That's what we need to do with our tech companies now as well. We need to get them to switch off of a business model that is both extractive and detrimental to human society, and get them to rebuild in a regenerative way that is actually adding to what society needs. There's a huge gap between where we are today and what that end goal is. And I don't think the solutions are going to come from, the people in our film have a lot of ideas. We need to bring a lot more people into the conversation. We need to bring the right people into these conversations. We need diversity. We need ethics. We need a new value system brought into these companies so that we can rebuild them in a way that works for society.
Absolutely right. And you know that we are 40 days out from a general election in the United States.
Yeah.
That is going to be one of the most important and perhaps strangest in the history of our country and the world. And that to that, what you were just saying, do you think that Facebook and the other social media giants could or should be made into a public utility?
There are conversations that people are having around antitrust and the idea of breaking them up. I think that doesn't really address the core problem. That's basically just taking ExxonMobil and breaking them back to Exxon and Mobil, and you still have climate change, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the conversations around a public utility are interesting. They've become our public square, and how do we treat them as such? Those are big conversations that I think a lot of legal scholars are working on. There are some that are proposing that we need to outlaw the very fundamentals of the business model. And what does that look like? So Shoshana Zuboff in our film says, there are things that we do outlaw. We outlaw the trade in human organs. We outlaw the trade of human slaves. Those are things that are not acceptable in our society. We now have these digital avatars of us that are being traded. Like, it is a digital version of us that is being mined from our experiences and traded on these markets that, different people are worth different amounts in these advertising markets, right? This is one of the crazy things. If you are of high net worth or if you're of low net worth, the system knows, and it's sending you different ads based on that. Mm-hmm. There are discriminatory practices happening built in inherently. Like, the whole system is designed to discriminate. Facebook actually used to allow, up until like 3 weeks ago, and they very quietly removed this feature, they used to allow advertising specifically by race and discrimination by race in the ad postings. So you could be like, it's become well known now, you could advertise housing opportunities and a rental property to certain types of people, and it goes against existing law. But it was totally fine on the Facebook platform because that's inherently how the system has been designed. So they just quietly removed that feature a couple of weeks ago and trying to let that one sweep under the rug. So these are, I mean, we could just go on for a long time about this. There's so many problems here. And I just want to bring it back to, nobody has insight into the algorithms, right? The public doesn't know, why is Facebook or Twitter or YouTube showing me this particular thing right now? One of my biggest hopes is that the public recognizes that anything that it shows you is customized for you, and that your family members and your friends and your significant other are seeing completely different things than you are. We all use the word Facebook and we all have this image of it, yet each of us is thinking of a different thing. There are 2.7 billion versions of Facebook out there, each of us in our own Truman Show, based on whatever we fed it.
It's an amazing phenomenon, and you make the point in your movie, or some of your protagonists make the point that that we're being tracked in real time. Every click we make, perhaps even every word we speak, depending on how you look at that. And
there's some platforms that are listening. So we know, like the Alexa and the Google Home are listening.
Right. And Oliver Stone, when he made the movie Snowden, went on, I think it was Colbert, and made a statement that everything is being recorded that's not already all being listened to, obviously, but there's big disks that are just spinning and recording. And this goes to the Patriot Act, I think, that was enacted after 9/11 and was reinstated during the Obama years. and we have a surveillance society. And so comment a little bit about how Facebook and Twitter and Google and the others, Instagram, et cetera, are feeding that information. I understand the algorithms towards the advertising dollar, but there's other uses of these algorithms.
So they're, in an ideal world, from an advertising perspective, I could spend money for a billboard that some might argue is an inefficient use of money, because now I'm advertising something to people that have no interest in my product. So the ideal scenario is I just want to advertise to one person. If I know Chip really, really well, and I know exactly what you're interested in, and I know exactly what you might be interested in buying, whether that's a product or an idea, then I can target you individually. So the more data that is collected about Chip, and now I have 29,000 data points on who you are and what you're interested in and your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities, like everything that you might be susceptible to. I know your mood. I know how you're feeling. I know when you're lonely. I know that every day at that particular hour is when you come to our platform and spend an hour on the platform. I know, based on the emotions that you express on these emojis, how you respond to different types of content. I know what you're angry at. I know what you're sad at. Facebook advertised at one point in Australia that they know when on a woman's cycle she is, and when you could target particular advertising based on moods on a menstrual cycle. That was something that Facebook promoted as a feature for their advertisers, which is just like such a crazy freaking like mind-boggling thing that they would do. So when they collect more information about you and they know what you're most vulnerable and most susceptible to, that's what's giving them the tools to say to people, hey, look, you should spend your money with us because your money is going to be most effective with us. What then happens is these tools don't necessarily get used for the most altruistic purposes, right? So Roger McNamee in our film says Russia didn't hack Facebook in the 2016 election. They just used Facebook, right? So we are seeing now in this election that Russia and other foreign actors they were just paying Americans to write stories that they were guiding and nudging in a particular way just to incite deeper emotions within our country. We know that foreign actors have set up events and brought people on different sides of an issue to the same street corner in Texas and had one perspective on one side and a different perspective on the other side and just wanted to see what would happen, right? We have created weapons of mass destruction by American companies that are being deployed on American soil by foreign agents at practically no cost. Like everything about that just seems, from a national security perspective, seems incredibly flawed, right? We have all of these defense systems that would prevent a Russian or Chinese or North Korean plane from entering our airspace unannounced, yet we have these invisible and non-existent borders around our digital infrastructure where these weapons can come and be dropped on us for practically no money and practically no awareness.
It's amazing that this has only happened in the last 20 years, and most of it in the last 5 or 10,
15,
I'd say, in terms of the exponential acceleration and growth of how these companies have learned how to use what they have been creating. It seems like, there's a word that is called the technostructure. I think it refers to where it's bigger than it's outside of any one single influence, but rather it's sort of outside of the human realm. And it's been around for a while, but how do you see this playing out now in the next 40 days, Jeff? I mean, I'll couch that by saying that, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and I mean, let me just march you through a quick timeline. So 1 year ago, we were focused on the arrival of Greta Thunberg and the UNGA and the global youth climate movement that went quickly into the build up to the impeachment of the president. That dominated the news cycles right up until COVID hit.
That dominated your news cycle, just to put an asterisk there, because there are lots of people who are hearing completely counterpoints to that, who hear great antagonism about Greta, who thought the impeachment was a complete sham. And they're in a different filter bubble than you or I might be. All right. So I just want to share that because we have a perspective of the world that is unique to us now, and in complete contrast to those who like your reality and a Trump supporter's reality are two totally different realities.
Right, and I realize that that's even outside the realms of the social media universes, because you have Fox News and you got MSNBC and
Right.
the majors and so
Right.
forth, and they're all spinning
Driven
and
by the same
skewing
advertising
to
models. Yeah.
their perceived base
Right.
of viewers.
Bases.
And so when COVID kicked in, the coronavirus kicked in. Barely had the president been exonerated by the Senate, and we went right into lockdown. And that was 3 months of lockdown where, pretty soon nobody could get a haircut, and we just couldn't wait to get out of there. Social distancing, the masks, but pretty much taking that seriously to the extent where we had the George Floyd event, and then the explosion around the country in terms of the protests that sometimes even turned violent. Now, what I'm asking you to consider is, how did these social media platforms move that along, and how are they moving along today on the 26th of September, when we have this national vote coming up in just over a month? Maybe you could comment on how the president's tweets and all of the other social media that's happening that's moving this entire national
Right.
perspective.
The way the way I've thought about this often is the way these platforms are operating. It's like they let any idea come in the door, and then they try to pour lighter fluid on everything. And anything that catches a spark and starts igniting, they can pour more lighter fluid on it. And the goal is to build as big of a fire as possible.
Is that a human?
Right? Because
sorry to interrupt. Is that a human function,
no,
or is that the algorithm?
that's not
rhythms itself?
That's the algorithm. So there are different algorithms that are operating on these platforms. Broadly, there are three main categories, but there's a lot of nuance. But there's one that's trying to get you to engage more. There's one that's trying to get the system to grow. There's one that's trying to optimize for advertising. These are broad buckets, and there are lots of nuances within each of them. There are things called a resurrection algorithm. So if you're a heavy user of a platform and you stop using it, the resurrection algorithm will try to figure out how to get you to come back. What can I throw at you to just like fish for you on a daily basis to figure out what's going to get Chip to come back to the platform today? And I can keep testing it until something gets you to come back. Right. So this is not a person sitting at a desk saying, how am I going to mess with Chip today? And what's going to get him to, come back and spend 5 hours of his day on this platform. So these are just the algorithms that are looking for, what does Chip like? What is Chip going to engage in? And the analogy that I've been using lately is like, imagine you went into a supermarket that was a smart supermarket, that was like Chip's personalized supermarket. And when you go in, it sees what you put in your cart. And then the next time you go back, it's going to give you more of the things that you put in your cart. But it also knows like, oh, Chip looked at the Rocky Road ice cream today. He didn't put it in his cart, but he looked at the Rocky Road ice cream. So the next time you go back, we're going to show you some more Rocky Road ice cream and different flavors of ice cream. And then it's going to continue to evolve based on what you engage with, what you look at, how much time you spend with it. So now I've got this whole profile of Chip. Chip loves his ice cream. He loves his cookies. He loves his potato chips. He gets rice and these other things every once in a while, and he gets blah, 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 but he really just loves the candy and the sweets, right? So you do that for a decade. You go to that same supermarket for a decade, and it's constantly learning and constantly morphing for you, customized for you. And after a decade of going through this like experience, you don't see green vegetables anymore. You haven't seen asparagus in years. You haven't seen Brussels sprouts in years. You never click on the Brussels sprouts. So what is your worldview going to be at that point, right? Each and every one of us who has been on a platform like this has had now years and years of self-reinforced learning. So that if you and I now are trying to talk about food, and your view of food is the candy and the sugar, and I'm still somehow eating like organic green leafy vegetables, we can't have a conversation around what food is anymore. Like our base facts are in such completely different worlds that they're almost incompatible. I mean, I've had this analogy around evolution and speciation, because it's almost as if like each of us is now on our own little Galapagos island, and each of our islands is just drifting farther and farther apart from each other. And over time, like those finches on one island and a different island are just completely different species, right? That's what we're seeing as a society.
So, given that this is the American Renewable Energy Day platform, and our day is now in its 17th year, and we've dedicated ourselves to the transition from fossil to renewable energy as a practical way of reining in some of the worst effects of runaway climate change. Now that the social media networks and the big companies like, I think Apple just hit a 2 trillion market cap, are far larger economically than the fossil fuel industry, as an example. And you can go through big pharma and just go through all the various sectors. Do you see that this is now becoming a tool that in other words, our best hopes remain within this ecosphere to implement the solutions, and the solutions can come in many different buckets. But remember, it's the atmosphere that we're talking about. We have to have a sustainable environment.
Is your question, will the solutions come via social media?
Can they?
My instinct is no. My instinct is the only way we have progress here is to have deep, meaningful, long-form conversation. Like, try to summarize what we have just been talking about on Twitter, right? Like, it's distilled these things down to how would you get the pithiest, short little sentence that's going to engage the most and get seen the most? Well, I've got to stupefy the ideas. I've got to round it down to the least common denominator. I've got to tap into deeper emotions. I've got to make it more anger-based or more outrage-based. How do we tap into something that's going to make people want to retweet it, that will just live for a moment and then disappear? And then you got to repeat the whole cycle again and find another pithy thing that's going to tap into some deep emotion that it's going to make somebody else angry or happy, or some emotion that's going to trigger them to want to engage with it. I haven't been on these platforms for the last 2 years, and I feel so much better because of it. And I've completely stopped using all social media, and I feel better as a human, as an individual. I feel greater mental clarity. I feel greater creative engagement. And that was a big part while making the film, recognizing how much my time and attention was being taken away from me through these platforms. Right. And then it was an act of resistance in some ways to make the movie and to turn off the notifications and get off the platforms and to install things like the newsfeed eradicator. So if I go to Facebook or Twitter, nothing shows up. There's nothing for me to scroll through because that entire feed has been blocked. So I mean, there are great things that still happen on these platforms, right? There are great movements that can happen. Movements have been happening for a very, very long time. And if we didn't have social media, movements would happen in a different place, like they have in the past. But these platforms right now, they offer connectivity. They're not real connection, right? So they're connectivity. They've removed all aspects of human engagement. We are getting so much more by looking at each other face to face right now and hearing and seeing responses in real time than you can ever get in a tweet storm. So these platforms have really like oversimplified the ability for us to converse. They've made it more and more difficult for us to have nuanced conversation. They are turning things into black and white extremes and crushing and destroying any sense of middle ground, any sense of compromise. So how do we as a society say, hey, look, these are the facts on climate change. Can we all agree on these facts? We can't even do that anymore, right? Like that's long gone. To try to picture Washington agreeing on the facts of climate change is a non-starter. But you need some sense of shared facts to be able to then say, what are we going to do about this? Like, what are the appropriate policies we should be putting in place to protect our society based on the facts that we can agree with? So these platforms have broken down a sense of shared truth, and we've been living in it now for years and years and years. So the unfortunate part is, just like with climate change, if we stopped emitting carbon right now, if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases right now, we would still have the inertia of the system that's going to take a long time for it to dissipate. That same thing exists on social media. We've had a breakdown of our information ecosystem for so many years now that even if social media just disappeared, we're going to have this long period of just trying to get back to a shared story before we're going to be able to have consensus building and compromise in a political system.
I want to turn our conversation to politics for a second, if we can. And so my colleague, David Orr, who is the author and professor from Oberlin College, has a book called Democracy Unchained. And he has a series, an internet series that he's producing right now on the stateofamericandemocracy.org. I recommend it highly for all of our viewers here today. And so, you know, we're confronted with some very, very dire circumstances in terms of our democracy at the moment. And
Yeah.
that the social media platforms have been engaged in that there can be simply no doubt. When the President of the United States communicates to the people through the Twitter, is just a very good example of that as his primary communication tool. So everything has changed in the last 4 years, especially in terms of the norms and the protocols, et cetera. And now, you know, we have a window of time where the very fundamental tenets of our democracy are being questioned. In other words, when the President of the United States can suggest to governors that they should basically commit to his reelection before the election, and I don't need to go into all the details. We know what the news has been. Do you think that the millennials, the Generation Z coming up behind them, the women of the country, the voters of the United States of America can use the information in your film, The Social Dilemma, to empower themselves to protect this sacred institution that we call American democracy?
In many ways, I do hope that the film can sort of serve as a way to inoculate the public around our awareness of what's going on these platforms. We have heard many people, we've heard that many people have watched the film and then have changed their patterns, or they've deleted social media, or they've gotten off in these platforms in different ways. And that's not necessarily my goal, but I would say that that's beneficial for the public, is to go back to news sources, look for diverse perspectives, surround yourself with opinions that you disagree with, even if that might be difficult. And we need to practice having meaningful conversations with people that we disagree with. I think the Gen Zers are feeling a different set of experiences when they watch the film, because they feel not as much the political manipulation, but the societal relationship manipulation. They feel the self comparison, the body image concerns, bullying online. And so we've had many youth come up to us and say that the film gives me an explanation now for why I feel the way that I feel. And the incredible stress that Gen Z has on it as an entire generation now, because they've grown up in this digital world where self-comparison is a huge part of one's digital existence. I mean, it's just a terrible way to grow up in my mind, where you're constantly thinking about how you compare to others, and you're like, there's literally a number that gives you a score of how well you're doing to other people, right? Middle school was freaking hard in the first place, and now you're constantly comparing yourself to these other beautiful, or muscle built guys, or whatever that you're seeing on a particular feed. I don't have kids. I'm quite fortunate that I don't have kids that are growing up through this medium right now. But I feel great empathy for parents who are dealing with, how do I balance my child's usage of these platforms and these technologies, and just saying no, you can't use them doesn't really help either, because all their friends are on it. So you're isolating them from an entire friend circle. Like, this is a terribly unfair way to grow up in my mind. So we've seen many students. We did a screening of the film at Sundance, and we had a bunch of high school students there, and it was a really powerful experience, and they wanted to take action immediately and share it because they could see how it was affecting them in their day-to-day lives and what it was doing to them and to their relationships. And many students came up to us and either said that they were suicidal, or that they had self-harm ideas, or that their friends fit that description, in large part because of the way these technologies have been putting this external pressure on them.
Well, and these children have grown up with one of these in their hands since they were
Right.
old enough to read, right? So they've been indoctrinated for their entire lives, pretty much, right?
Exactly. I mean, we remember a world before smartphones and social media. Like, I remember what it was like to ride my bike in the afternoon after school and go down the block and go hang out with a friend nearby, and we would play outside, and it was the small group of people, and that was a childhood that, for me. And now you compare that to the social pressure that exists. If you have a group of people that are hanging out together and now somebody knows that they weren't invited to that particular group of people, it's like broadcast through these systems, and then you feel left out. And like, there are all these dynamics that are happening amongst youth in particular, which is another whole can of worms. So the struggles and the challenges for teenagers, and for parents of teenagers, one of the things that I would really encourage is that, watch the movie with your family, watch the movie with your kids, and have your kids' friends watch the movie together as well, so that the parents can have a conversation around, like, what are we going to do together to help protect our children? Let's get our kids off of these social media platforms, and they can still text and call each other, and they can still hang out in different ways, but remove the social media pressures from them. How do you get entire schools and PTAs and school districts to come together and say, you know what, we don't want our middle school kids on these platforms. You're not allowed to in our school. Like, that is a movement that's happening in different places. Many are saying, no social media until high school, or there's a movement called wait until eighth grade to get on these platforms. So this is what has made the making of this movie so incredibly difficult, because there are countless issues that we see at the individual level and at the societal level. Not to mention the amplification of racism that is happening on these platforms as well. So there are just countless aspects of this that we can unpackage. But going back to some sense of hope and some sense of optimism, this is just code that was written by a handful of people. A few hundred, a couple thousand people in total have written the code that is now puppeteering all of society. In some ways, it's actually much easier to solve than it is to solve climate change, because climate change, we have this incredible physical infrastructure that has been replicated all around the planet. But in this case, like, the software gets updated every couple of weeks. How can we rebuild the software? How can we make it work for society's interests? What does regenerative technology look like, right? Just as we're talking about, how do we create regenerative ecosystems? How do we create regenerative food? How do we create regenerative communities? What does it look like to have technology that is actually enhancing the social fabric and not tearing it apart?
It's interesting. And then when you start to factor in some of the emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and how the markets are moving in terms of adopting these practices, I just want to make go ahead and comment on that, and then I want to move into another phase.
Well, I mean, artificial intelligence is so much of what these algorithms that are being used by these tech companies are forms of machine learning, artificial intelligence, right? They are learning on their own. Now, that can be used for great positive things, or it could be used for great negative things, right? I want my doctor to have a really accurate model of my body and my health, and I want an AI to help my doctor figure out what I'm susceptible to. That sounds great. But I want to be in control of that. I want that to be between me and my doctor. I don't want my insurance company to have that information and be, selling me something based on my health metrics, right? So insurance companies now, when we go into the surveillance capitalism part of the conversation, right? Insurance companies are trying to install things in people's cars and they're offering you a discounted rate, but really they're just trying to track you and get data about your driving patterns and your driving behavior. And we know who you are and what your patterns are, and we're going to optimize that for our financial benefit. There are countless examples of this. So prison sentencing right now is determined in large part by algorithms. And if you feed the algorithm historical data that is racist, then it will only perpetuate racist outcomes. So if the data that is being fed into the system says, oh, in this community, Black people cause more crimes than white people because of the pattern of policing in that neighborhood, it's going to just replicate the same things that we're trying to overcome. There are countless examples like this, right? And so we've now entered into an era, and this goes beyond the scope of what we're talking about in the social dilemma, but we've entered into this era of surveillance capitalism and algorithms that run our world. Algorithms that are being used for hiring decisions, algorithms that are being used for college application admittance, right? And these algorithms are being based on historical data that in many cases is biased. So this is like a huge, this is not an easy thing to unpackage. Part of me feels like we need something along the lines of a department of algorithms where there is third-party transparency, and you have algorithmic auditors, like people like Kathy O'Neill in our movie, and she's created a company that does algorithmic auditing so that you don't have to reveal your trade secrets to the world, but let's get people in to confirm and see, wait a second, your algorithms are biased. They were hiring algorithms that proposed to the recruiters that at some companies, men named Jared that played lacrosse were the most optimal person for the hiring algorithm, because historically at that company, men who were named Jared who played lacrosse did well within that company. So how messed up is, we have basically just ceded control to computers in countless aspects of our life. And once again, it was really challenging to wrap our heads around this in making this film because of the incredible intellectual complexity of all of this, the incredible complex nature of how many different areas we're talking about. So some of what we're discussing here goes beyond the scope of what we put in the movie. But if people are interested, we're putting more and more resources on our website, on thesocialdilemma.com, to really watch our film, go watch a film called Coded Bias, go read these countless books, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. There are more and more books coming out around. There's a book called Algorithms of Oppression that has come out a couple years ago. That's all of these conversations are growing. There is a huge, huge area where the public needs to inform themselves, in my mind, so that we can put pressure on these companies and on politicians to put into place meaningful guardrails for how we want these self-learning computer programs to control society.
Wow, Jeff, amazing. So at a time of great social, ethical, and I would say physical in terms of climate upheaval.
Yes.
And as we look forward into the future, I'd like to kind of conclude today's interview with this looking forward into the future piece of the conversation. So as an example, today, Fridays for the Future is having a mass rally in New York City relative to the United Nations and the end of the UN.
Happy Climate Week.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is Generation Z, but it's everybody else that's involved. And now I think Black Lives Matter is getting involved a little bit too. But my point is that as these youth are marching through the streets of New York and around the world, by the way, today, this particular Friday, I know Greta's active today and so forth. Shea, some of the others, Alexandria Villaseñor, who was on the Democratic National Convention, you might have seen her there. The question is, do you think we can affect real world emotions without triggering the user's awareness? And can we do this to activate a mass leveling of society? In other words, it's a complicated question, but in a world of haves and have-nots, where the gap continues to widen very, very rapidly, can we affect people's thinking in a positive way as opposed to a negative way? And would the social media algorithms do that?
Could they? Absolutely, yes. Would they? I certainly don't think so. Nor do I know what their role. I mean, they're Facebook in particular and Twitter. They're very, very concerned around free speech notions. So they've really tried to not hamper anything, regardless of its accuracy or truth. So and at the same time, it's very difficult for an algorithm to identify if something is true or not. We don't have a truth proxy right now. And according to Kathy O'Neill, it'll be very, very difficult to impose one because the only metric that they can measure right now is the click. Well, that's the easiest metric to measure, right? How many times something has been engaged with. So if you're asking, could they use the power of their platforms to solve climate change? I mean, they in many ways they could, I believe, but it's such a complex issue, right? This is a really, really challenging issue. We've had years and years now where there are many people who have been reinforced a denialism about climate through these very platforms. How do you shift people who are skeptical in an authentic way? That's what we've been trying to do with our films. That's what we've been trying to do with our impact campaigns. I believe that stories are empathy machines, that films are empathy machines, to quote Roger Ebert, and that we can use the power of an emotional story to get people to wake up in some cases. We saw this with great effect with our films Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral, where even climate skeptics would then see the film and come away converted and recognize, wait a second, the information that I was operating off of might be flawed. And I have to re-examine my questions. I have to re-examine my stance and my values on something because new information has come in and has made me question those thoughts. My hope is that we are all open-minded enough to change our opinion when presented with accurate, factual information. It's a really tough thing to do, especially when we've all been reinforced down particular paths. And on my own side, I've been questioning my own stance on things. When working on this film, I learned that Russian propagandists were pushing out anti-fracking propaganda. And I use that phrase intentionally and carefully, but it made me question, wait a second, I have an assumption around fracking. I have an opinion about fracking. Why am I believing what I believe if I'm now learning that Russia actively put this type of information in front of me? So wait a second, let me take a step back and explore what is the truth of the matter and how do I get to the truth and how do I not trust what I might see or a meme that I might see? So in this particular instance, it hasn't really changed my stance on fracking, but it has made me really question, why do I think what I think? And I think that's something that we all need to sort of embrace and look at, to open ourselves up to the difficult conversations with people that we disagree with. I've been suggesting to people that you do a reality swap. Those family members that you can't talk about politics with, show them your Facebook feed and take a look at their Facebook feed. Swap Twitter feeds. This is what I'm being served every day. What are you being served every day? We're not choosing the menu from which we're seeing life.
So it's also important to recognize that the manipulation in the case that you point out with Russia was not because they're such environmental stewards, but rather they don't want competition in the natural gas sector.
Exactly. Right.
That they want to dominate globally.
Absolutely. And it's hard to know all those motivations as well. Like, why is Russia pushing out a particular story? Why and how are Russia or China or others trying to affect and influence our election right now? We know that it's happening. I've been telling friends for a while now, if you get your news and information through a news feed, through one of these platforms, I'm not going to trust your view of facts anymore, right? Like I have a hard time trusting that if that's your main source of information. Even if the majority of what you see might actually be true, a lot's sneaking through. So go to news organizations and pay for your news if you can, and look for news that you might disagree with politically, and help that inform your view of the world, and hopefully it'll allow for more civil conversations with people that are in our society that you might disagree with.
You know, Jeff, in a world of three distinct existential crises that are unfolding, one would be, of course, the climate crisis based on the burning of fossil fuels. Two would be the human population, and to note that both track about the same on the hockey stick graph. And that I would say that the third would be the nuclear threat. That we can.
I would put our technological platforms are an existential threat in my mind. They are programming us to be incompatible with each other, right? They're programming us to be more outraged and angered by the world around us. I look at this as a foundational issue underneath all other issues, that we won't be able to solve population or climate or nuclear issues, or racism, or fill in the blank issue that you care about, if we have a platform that is inherently designed to discriminate and polarize. And these platforms are causing that in our society right now.
Well, you know, I want to try to wrap this up on a positive note, if we can, and we can, because I think like social media and everything else in life, it's all a choice, and we can choose what platform we want to go to, what click we want to make, and what word we want to speak in any given time in our lives. And so I'm interested in the empowerment of humanity and the empowerment of individuals to step up to the plate and know that now is our time, and that all of these problems are solvable. So I would say that, you know, to go back to the conversation around at a time when the gap is widening between the haves and the have-nots to critical proportions, can the Social Dilemma, your movie, and perhaps your next project, help to reverse this trend?
It's certainly my hope, right? My hope is that the film can be a wake-up call. My hope is that the film will shake people out of their matrix-induced worldview and get us out of the matrix. My hope is that the film can help be a reminder to people that that the film is a shared truth about our breakdown of a shared truth. That's something that one of our subjects, Tristan Harris, is constantly talking about, that the film can serve that role. My optimism waxes and wanes, you know, it comes and goes. In large part, I feel like my optimism comes from my pessimism, in that I believe things are going to get worse, and that it will take those scenarios getting worse before we do wake up. But at the end of the day, I am optimistic that we will rebuild in a much stronger and much more resilient way. Like, from a very literal perspective, human society will not sustain itself unless we switch to sustainable and regenerative methods, whether that's our energy production or that's our information production and the way we relate to each other as a society. So I am excited and eager for a future of regenerative technology and regenerative living that will make life better on the planet for all of its inhabitants. And equally, I'm excited in the future for when we have technology that is really designed around, this is how a society works. This is the Dunbar number. This is how humans relate with each other. This is what brings out negative emotions in people, and this is what brings out constructive emotions in people. And can we redesign our technology to actually fit the way humans work with each other, the way we interact, the way we talk, the way we relate? That technology, I'm very, very confident in. You know, 20 years ago, we had AOL and MySpace, and those platforms completely disappeared. And these technologies that we interact with now, I do not think this is the inevitable march of progress by any means. These are tech platforms that were built around a business model that we now see as extractive and exploitative, that are causing harm to human society. And my hope is that the public sees that and wakes up and says, no, I don't want to take part in that. I don't want to be a cog in this machine. I don't want to be used in this fashion. And that we demand change, or we leave these systems, and new and better and healthier platforms will be born in their wake. I'm incredibly optimistic about the next generation of social media technologies that come out that will make us feel better when we use them, that will make us feel more human when we use them, that will make us feel more tightly knit with our family and our friends and our close circles. That's the goal in my mind. And I believe that future will come. And I would pay for those products, right? I want to pay for something that's going to give me a stronger relationship with my friends. That's something that I think we're going to see come out. And it's just a matter of how long will it take for us to get there.
Great response. And then the follow-up question to that would be, in the manipulation business of social media, could you envision a time when this tech is used for the power of good? As an example, a social media platform to save ourselves from ourselves. Do you think that we could popularize our own survival? And if so, how so?
That's certainly an exciting idea. I think we still have a ways to go for people to recognize the seriousness of what's at stake, right? And it seems as though there are so many that are so complacent with our current status quo. So that is where a lot of my hope around stories and films from diverse people for diverse audiences can come out and can continue to wake people up to the reality of what's going on. My personal belief as a filmmaker and as an artist, that those of us in our society that are making, I hate using the word content, but who make things for our society are making them with great intention and care around, is this adding to the human experiment? Is this advancing our society? Is this helping to inform? Is it helping to educate? There are countless times where I just want to make a funny movie, and but funny movies can also contribute to a society, right? And can improve the way we see ourselves and the way we understand ourselves. And my hope is that everybody is moving more and more towards those contributions to society. We don't have enough time on this planet to waste the time. We need to be taking action in so many ways, in so many levels. Our problems seem to be getting worse and worse, and we need to equally improve the tools and the stories and the ideas and the conversations so that we can solve these problems and work our way towards a better future that we want to live in.
Well, to that end, can you talk a little bit about some of the future projects that you're contemplating?
We are focusing just on this movie right now. I've got a crazy long list of films I'd love to make, but all of them are completely on the back burner because we want to maximize what this film can do. I want people to have this conversation. I'd love to see the business models of the tech companies change first. And then I will say, okay, great. Now we can work on the next movie. Let's tackle the next problem. And whether it's climate, whether it's tech, whether it's systemic racism, whether it's a countless litany of issues that we're dealing with in our society right now, how can everybody work towards building that better future? My company, my team at Exposure Labs, that's what we're committed to, and that's what we're focusing on, whether it's in the storytelling or the impact campaigns that we do with those films. So we have a long way to go with both our tech crisis and with our climate crisis. So I don't know when I'm going to pick up a camera again, but lots of work to do.
Yeah, I hear that. Well, okay, so between now and November 3rd, what's the plan for the social dilemma?
We just hope that people can watch the movie, that it can be a wake-up call for us individually. As I said, do a reality swap with people you disagree with. Ask yourself hard questions. Why do you have the worldview that you have? And to interrogate that for yourself and for your friends, and to push yourself outside of your comfort zone. And that would be my immediate response there. This is a long journey that we're on to fix these issues. We have a broken environmental ecosystem and we have a broken information ecosystem. These are not quick and easy solves. Our team is really working to bring together more and more people to have shared conversation around what do we do moving forward? How do we don't go into solutions in the film. We try not to go to solutions in the film. Those are conversations that we need to have as a follow-up. So we're trying to host many of those conversations virtually in a way that we can as a small team. So if there are conversations that you'd like to have, go to our website and please suggest conversations or speakers that we can bring together, so we can get a sense of what are the paths moving forward and what could that look like. So that's one of the things that has me very, very excited.
Great. You know, some would say that we also have a broken political system. And my very good friend John Powers is, you know, he's got a quote that I'm fond of. He's looking for Red Adair, and you might remember Red Adair was the man who was able to go and put out the Kuwait oil fires when they were raging, and nobody could figure it out. And they brought him out of Texas, and he had the experience and the know-how to do that. And so, at a time when we're suffering from gerrymandering and all of the issues that are polarizing and making our society more and more tribal, and tribalism seems to be really up, and the media, the social, is just fueling that fire, as you've been saying in this interview. You know, bringing it back home to Colorado, I just want to point out that there's a Proposition 113 that is basically trying to undermine an order that Governor Polis has signed, saying that we're going to commit our electoral votes to the popular vote. And that's being undermined. And I'm ending this interview with this particular comment, bring it back home to Colorado question, because, you know, I think you and I are both so proud of the history of Colorado in the last 20 years, the leadership of Governor Ritter and Senators, you know, Bennett and Udall, and that we're a purple state, and we know how to work across the lines, and that we have very good Republican elected representatives too here. So just some concluding thoughts about how do you plan to operate? Are you concerned about the seemingly deterioration day by day now of our political system?
Absolutely. I mean, it is just mind-boggling. I think that social media and the polarization that we see there is just kind of adding fuel to the fire. Um, there's another, I mean, there are amazing films about democracy and the breakdown of democracy, and it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I'm very curious about, what does a direct democracy look like? How do we get to, can we have some proxy candidates that are basically running on a platform of, I'll vote based on what my constituents say? I think that's a very, very fascinating and interesting idea that doesn't require any new laws, but will undermine our two-party system that has become so polarized and flawed, and can go back to the will of the people in a very direct way. I'd love to see somebody run on that kind of platform. And this goes beyond my, you know, my real study and expertise, but I think these systems are all so interconnected. So that I'm not sure if I have much more to add there, but it is a frightening future that we live in, based on how our political system is structured right now, and it seems to be hanging on by a thread, and I hope it makes it through. And all the more reason why the public needs to get engaged. Like, this is the idea of this democracy is an experiment that necessitates our participation as citizens. We have to get involved. We have to be knowledgeable, and we have to take action and participate. And that would be my hope to everybody moving forward. Like, learn as much as you can and definitely vote.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a brilliant interview, and I really appreciate your time, and most importantly, I really appreciate your fine work. And I know that the next film that you make will just continue your trajectory. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Yep. Thanks, Jeff.